Hello everyone. We'll be continuing on our module on architecture and the basics of Buddhist and Jain architecture. So, we have already covered the impact of the Mauryan Empire and especially looking at Ashoka's rule and how that made a huge impact on the way in which we understand Buddhist architecture today, and of course their impact on this particular land capital that we see as the symbol of the Republic of India today. Now, from there, if we move further, we find that after the Mauryan rule, there was a of the Shungas that was there in the 2nd and 3rd century BC, and then afterwards we find that there were the rules of the Kushanas. The Kushanas were the ones who came from Central Asia, and we find that they ruled from northern India. So during this time period, we find that two regions, I'd say that came into prominence. One will be the area around Mathura, that is in the state of Uttar Pradesh today, and then the other part will be the Gandhara, which is part of northern Pakistan today. So these are the two sites we find that came into prominence during the rules of the Kushanas, and during this time what we find that these two different places, even though there are a number of Buddhist sculptures and architectural practices that we find to be prevalent during this time, but we find that during these times, even though the sites of Mathura and Gandhara, these places were developing simultaneously, but there was a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of how material was used and how the Buddhist images and the architecture was constructed. So we will start the discussion with the images that we find in the Gandharan region. So Gandharan region, as we know, for its geographical location, as well as for the political relations with the Greeks who were active there, and then with its proximity to the Silk Route, this historic Silk Route which connected China and northern part of India to Europe. So for these things we find that a very specific kind of image making practice that came into prominence in the Gandharan region, and some of the examples will be the ones we have on screen. So for example, we find that the region of Gandhara, it started being developed from the 2nd century BC, and then it was developed further until 5th century AD. So it was a long time period in which we find that this place was active. Now we do not really have the Kushanas ruling these places between like 2nd century BC and 5th century AD. They were active in the 2nd and 1st century BC. However, this image making practices and different kind of sculpture and architecture making practices, they persisted in this region and they flourished with time. Now, if we see some of the characteristic feature of this the Gandharan sculptures, the one we have on screen in the left side, we have an image of Bodhisattva. Now, what is a Bodhisattva? We have already looked into the idea of Buddha, who is this enlightened one, and who was a human being who was a prince from the site of Kapilavastu, and then he embraced the path of asceticism and then attained enlightenment at the site of Bodh Gaya. Now the Bodhisattvas, as Buddha had already said that he is not the only person who had attained enlightenment. There had been many other people who had been Buddhas in the past, and there will be people in the future who will also be Buddhas. So he did not make his position as an exclusive one, and he also made a claim that all the people around us, everyone who are on the path to self discovery, can be understood as Bodhisattva. So Buddha's previous births are considered to be that how he was born as Bodhisattvas, and he followed the righteous path. So those are the ones which we also find in the Jataka stories, which have been very popular in the Buddhist context. Now the Bodhisattvas in the Buddhist context, even though Buddha had considered everyone who is in the path of self-discovery can be considered as Bodhisattva, however, as the Bodhisattva as a Buddhist deity, when we see in this context, mostly in the Mahayana context, we find that Bodhisattvas are considered to be the ones who had the knowledge of enlightenment, but still they did not leave the earth, and only to help the people who are around us to attain enlightenment, to be conscious and to be liberated. So this is the reason what we find that the Bodhisattvas are considered to be the ones who are the compassionate ones, who are the ones who have compassion towards all the living beings in the earth, and they help everyone for attaining enlightenment or being on the righteous path. So this is the reason what we find that the Bodhisattva figures, they are considered to be these compassionate ones, and this empathy in their face and their bodily gestures are also something that is portrayed in the sculptures. The other feature that we also find in the Bodhisattva sculptures is that the Bodhisattva sculptures are usually being shown as royal figures, as opposed to the monk-like figure of Buddha. That is also a major distinction that we can make between the Bodhisattvas and Buddha. Now here what we find is that there is a high degree of naturalism, something that we have already seen in the Mauryan time, but that had also been developed further. But in this case what we find that the naturalism, what is evident here, is slightly different from the ones which we have perhaps been existing in the Indian subcontinent. But this high degree of naturalism also comes from the study of anatomy from the European context and from the Greco-Roman context, because of their relationship with the Greeks in this region of Gandhara. And that is the reason what we find that the proportion of the body, all the features of the eyes, the nose, lips and so on, all those ones are done not only by looking into the the beauty standards of this time, or like the iconographic features of this time, but also how it can respond to the conventions of anatomy in the Greco-Roman context. So that is the reason what we find that these figures, they look very close to the ones which are created in the Greco-Roman context in Europe, and also the details that we have in their body. For example, how the drapery or the fabric that flows in from the shoulder to their waist and so on. So those are the ones which are done with utmost care, which is not stylized at all, and they are very much naturalistic the way we find them in the in our surrounding. So something that we can closely associate with the Greco-Roman sculptures during the same time. What else we also find that there are the features, the physical features, which also look like they are from the particular region, which is this bordering region between South Asia, Central Asia and a part of the Middle East. So that is the reason we find that the physical features and so on, and the facial features, they also respond to this region. However, that said, we also find that certain kind of iconographical traits. So, for example, the urna or this particular this mark on the forehead of Buddha and the Bodhisattvas that is present here, and then like something that is there as a halo behind his head, which marks his divine presence. So those are the other features that we also find here. And then what else we also find are those very important hand gestures. So as we have started to address that there are some of the hand gestures or mudras. So for example, the Bhumisparsha mudra, in which we find that Buddha had touched the earth for bearing the evidence of his enlightenment, or the other one will be the Dharmachakra Pravartana Mudra, which we have here featured in this Bodhisattva sculpture as well. And then the other mudras we also find, those we can perhaps continue to talk about in the Mathuran context. Now, so if these are the kind of like sculptures that we find, they are the ones which are made from this local schist stone. So that is a big difference in terms of how we have studied mostly the sandstone sculptures from the northern India, and this one for its the geographical difference. So we find that schist stone is used, which is little more easier to carve, I'd say that, from sandstone, and that also gives us this liberty of implementing more details there. And then it is believed that in some cases the schist stone sculptures were covered with stucco like layers, and stuccos are made of the stucco layer is made of lime, plaster and hay and some kind of gum or additive material and so on, and that became a smooth paste which was applied on the top of the sculptures, and for having much more clearer details and the intricacy that cannot be achieved on stone. And then those sculptures were painted. So in some of the sculptures we do have marks of this stucco, and for its material character in some cases we do not have the stucco that is existing anymore, but in some cases we do find the marks of the stucco, the remnants of those materials, as well as we also have marks of the paint, from which we can imagine that all the sculptures that we see them, or the ones that we have on screen, they were initially been covered with this lime plaster, and then they were painted to have this very lifelike appearance. Now, the other sculpture that we have on screen, and that is a stair riser. So that we can imagine that this is a stair riser that comes from 1st century AD and from the Gandharan region in northern Pakistan, and this was perhaps been part of a stupa. So even though we are seeing it as a relief or a panel like a sculpture, but it was initially been part of a architecture, and that would be a stupa. So here the stair riser is basically like how there are the stairs for if there is a particular platform, on the top of that there is a stupa. So the visitors or the devotees will require the stairs to climb up to this platform and circumambulate the stupa. So for those places we find that in the stair riser this kind of sculptures were there, and it was found in fragments, so we do not know the scale of this stupa or this particular site from which it was found. However, if we see some of the details those have been added to this particular panel in the stair riser, we find there are the river gods, which or like they either look like boatmen or they are the river gods, and this particular way of depiction of the figures, their muscles and their anatomy and so on, all these are very much a clear evidence of how the Greco-Roman sculptures and the Greco-Roman visual culture and art that made a huge deal of influence in the sculpture and architecture making in the Gandharan region. And again, this is made from schist stone, which is again it's a difference from how we have studied the ones in northern India. Now, from there if we move back to northern India to the site of Mathura, where we see that there was also a flourishing center during the Kushana period. And this is another sculpture that we find that comes from 1st century. As I have said that this the sites of Gandhara and sites of Mathura, they had been developing simultaneously. So here what we have, there is this a very different form of Buddha, and this Buddha figure is made in high relief, in which we see that the figures are almost in round, they are almost freestanding, but they are still attached to a background, and the background we can see that there had been a huge halo behind their head, which also makes it a kind of a back support. So it is not just a halo for the religious purpose, but it is also for giving the sculpture stability. And this is made from a Sikri sandstone. Sikri sandstone, or the Mathura sandstone that we have there, that the slightly the reddish one or the Mathura one, we have either the reddish sandstone we find, or the gray or the slightly yellowish one we find. So those are the different kinds of sandstone we find. And what we have here in Mathura, that the making of the sculpture of Buddha, even though we are dealing with the same deity, even though we are dealing with the same iconographic conventions, but we find that the regional standards of beauty, perhaps, as well as that how figures, how human beings, how deities were perceived by the artisans in Mathura was quite different from the way we see in the Gandharan context. So here what we have, that Buddha is this majestic figure who sits on this simhasana, or this lion throne, and Buddha has been considered to be the Shakya Simha, or the lion of the Shakya clan. So that is the reason we always find in many representations we find that Buddha is represented on Simhasana, or the lion throne. So in this lion throne we also have script which perhaps describes it further about about its dedication, as well as the details of the people who have commissioned it, and so on. And what the other things that we find here is this, the depiction of the eyes, the depiction of the facial features, and so on. They are somewhere in between the naturalistic depiction as well as the idealistic one. So for example, the lotus like eyes, the eyebrows which are joined as a bow, and then all those different features that we find to be part of the iconographical convention, they have been implemented here in a different way from the ones we have studied in the Gandharan context. Now we also have, there are two other figures who are the attendant figures who are by the two sides of Buddha, and Buddha has his right hand raised in the posture of this Abhaya Mudra, or the posture of reassurance. So when the palm is raised like this, this is considered to be this Abhaya Mudra, which is also considered the fear not gesture, in which the deity assures the devotees that whatever happens, the devotee will be there to protect, the deity will be there to protect the devotees. And that is something that we also find to be represented in many of the Buddha sculptures. So here we find the Buddha's figure to be almost like a majestic ruler, as opposed to the empathetic one that we have seen in the Gandharan context. It is not the case for all the sculptures that we find in the Mathuran region. However, this is one of the significant ones that we find, that how this really well built and majestic ruler like figure, that is Buddha, who is represented in this form. Now the other thing we also find to be this flowing drapery which almost disappears in the body, and that is something that we find it also responds to the geographical region that northern India is in. Because of its summer and this high heat, we also need the clothes which will be lightweight and which will not be heavy as the one that we perhaps see in the Gandharan context. And that is the reason there are this certain features, or certain this features or these peculiarities that we find, they were prevalent in part of the mainland India, which will perhaps talk about the geographical and the climatic condition in these regions as well. So from there we also find that how this particular way of image making had also made a huge deal of impact on the making of the stupas. So we have already spoken about the Sanchi stupa, but before that there was also this other stupa which is again in Madhya Pradesh, Bharut, and in Bharut what we find that there was this ingenious way of making this massive architectural structures, and those relied on the use of the lintel and the pillars. So, like we have the bars, the horizontal bars and the vertical columns, and how they were brought together in the railings that we have. So, these massive railings which were made from granite stone, which is another very hard stone as opposed to the one we have in sandstone. So, in Sanchi we have the sandstone sculptures, and then what we have that how this stone also makes a difference in terms of how the sculptures are produced on the top of them. Now, for both Bharut and Sanchi we also find how these places, perhaps that there are some of the inscriptions that suggest that the Sanchi stupa was originally erected by Emperor Ashoka, and but it was later renovated. So, during the Shunga period we also find that the Sanchi stupa was rebuilt, and during this time it was not just one person who contributed to making the stupa, but it was a group of people. So, for example, the royals, the merchants and so on, they will contribute to making this stupa, these elaborate gateways around them and so on, and that is the reason we find that the stupa complexes were not being built at the same time, but they were periodically built. And the site of Sanchi, we find that that was active from the 2nd century BC or 1st century BC to at least until 12th century AD. So, that was a long time in which we find that these sites were very relevant. Now, here we have not only an image of the railings from Bharut, but we also have some of these really interesting medallions where there are those narrative scenes in which we find the worshipping of the Dhamma Chakra or the worshipping of the capitals or the pillars. So, for example, the one we have here, this is clearly an Ashokan pillar with this lotus and then the animal, and on the top of that there is this chakra, and we have the devotees in both sides how they are worshipping it. So, some of the things that those are missing from the Ashokan pillars, like for example this chakra, that we can reconstruct their history by looking at this kind of sculptures. So, from there if we come back to the Sanchi stupa, we find that as part of the Sanchi stupa, since in the stupa there are no place for decoration. So, that is something that had been because for the Sanchi stupa we find that it was made with stone and brick, and it was perhaps been plastered. However, there are no other sculptural elements, those are added on the body of this hemispherical dome. Now, since those things were not present, we find the need for narrating the stories from the Jataka or from Buddha's life, those were been conveyed in these elaborately made gateways of Sanchi. And here we have the northern gateway of the Sanchi, the great stupa at Sanchi, and that was made during the 1st century BC. Now, another thing about Sanchi, it is a site which is around 30 kilometers from Bhopal, as I have said earlier, and this is a site where there were stupa. It's not just one stupa which had the relic of Gautama Buddha, but there were many other stupas where perhaps some of the memorial stupas were there, and some of the stupas might have contained relics of the important Buddhist monks and nuns. Now, those stupas were there, and they were side by side with the monasteries and the places of learning and education. So, life and death continued at the same place. There was not really a division between the place which were dedicated to the dead ones and the ones who are the living ones. And what happens in this northern gateway that we find here is this: there are tremendous amount of details in which the narrations from Buddha's life and from the Jataka stories have been conveyed. So we have how there are those narrative panels which run horizontally, and almost like in a way how the scrolls are being shown. So like the painted scrolls, how they are opened, they are unfolded, and then they are folded again. So almost like that fashion is continued here, how they also narrate the stories. And if we also pay attention to how the figures, they are also been shown. So the central figures, for example, here the figures of these mighty elephants, they come to the center of this this panel, where there is this depiction of a tree, which is perhaps the Bodhi tree. And then there are also some of the other elements in which we find how the animals, they are being shown, they always point to the center, and that is where the object of veneration, the Bodhi tree or any other symbol of Buddha, is there. Now, apart from those things, we also find something ingenious, and those are the brackets here. And these brackets are also called Shala Vanjika, and these are the Shala Vanjikas are the ones in which we find there is a woman. She holds a branch of the Shala tree, and she places one of her legs, one of her foot on the roots of the Shala tree. And this is a sign which had been considered that it can be a symbol of Queen Maya, who was Buddha's mother, and who also gave birth to Buddha in this particular posture. But it is also something that is considered to be a particular kind of ritual in which the women, they would be associated with a flowering and flowering tree or a blossoming tree, in which life, prosperity and fertility are symbolized, and they are implemented. So and this is a particular sculpture that we also find that this is very tactfully placed in this particular area to support the horizontal bars. And this particular way in which the sculptures are made, that makes the use of an architectural bracket, but it also serves as part of the sculptural need as part of it. So architecture, sculpture, narration and their usability in the entire structure, all these things we find them to be running together simultaneously. So if the needs of the architecture is covered, it's not like the narrative needs are ignored. So all those needs are taken care of by the artisans in Sanchi. That's what we find, and that is also something that we find to be that which contributed to the appreciation of these particular structures. Now, the other thing that we also find that there are many different ways of narrations which are implemented in these structures. So, for example, here we have how there are continuous narrations, that the narration continues in these forms, and even here there is a journey of Emperor Ashoka that we find that has been depicted here, and how the figure of Emperor Ashoka that not only appears once but multiple times in the same horizontal panel to show there is a progression of this narrative. So if there are this kind of narratives, this continuous narratives that we find there, and then there are also the other kind of narratives, for example, the image of the Buddha or the worshipping of this Ashokan pillar. So that shows a very different kind of a single scene narrative. So all these different strategies were also implemented as part of these structures. Now, at the end, I also wanted to address that how the spread of Buddhism was not limited to part of central and northern India, and then there was this very significant stupa that we find in the place Amravati. So, Amravati is today in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and in that area we find that it was not just one site, but there were many sites which came into prominence. So, for example, Amravati, Ghantashala, and then Fanigiri and Nagarjuna Konda and so on. And here what we find that they used limestone, white limestone, which almost looks like marble, and then those white limestones were used for making this great stupa at Amravati. Now, this site had also been in the ruins, and many of these artifacts had been collected either in the Government Museum Chennai or mostly in the British Museum in London. So, some of the ones which we see them, they are all in fragments, and some of the fragments like the one we have on screen, that sort of shows the amount of details and the grandeur of this particular structure. So, going with the depiction that we have here, the stupa structure is not just unadorned, but there are sculptures already on the body of this stupa, and perhaps there is a sign that there was a long tall standing figure of Buddha that was also made part of this, that was worshipped in this particular structure. So, this kind of different ways in which we find that how Buddhist architecture had flourished in different parts of the Indian subcontinent, though there are some of the similarities, but there were also the regional additions which enriched the making and the flourishing of Buddhist art and architecture in the Indian subcontinent.